All right, so today we're going to be looking at Indigenous diversity in Australia.
Okay.
And this is something that a lot of people, I think, have misconceptions about.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to be basing this deep dive off of an SBS article, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's basically diving into just how diverse the Indigenous population of Australia really is.
Right.
And I think that's what a lot of people don't know. You know, when we think of like Indigenous Australian,
Yeah.
we kind of think of it as like a homogenous group.
Right.
But it turns out there are roughly like 500 distinct nations within that.
Yeah, it's closer to comparing it to like all of Europe
Right.
rather than, just one single country.
Yeah. It's more like continents worth of diversity.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're going to be diving into today. And the article actually talks about the importance of understanding this diversity,
Mm-hmm.
not just from like a historical perspective, but also from a contemporary perspective.
Right.
And how it really impacts, how we interact with different Indigenous communities today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the article really does a good job of making that clear.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's not just a historical footnote.
Right.
This is something that is so important to how we understand and interact with Indigenous communities right now.
Absolutely.
And it's something that I think a lot of people just don't really grasp.
Yeah, and one of the things that they talked about was language.
Mm-hmm.
How, like, the article mentions that there were originally over 250 distinct Indigenous languages and 800 dialects.
Incredible.
It's mind-blowing, and it makes you think about, like, the sheer range of communication styles that existed.
Yeah.
And how those different communication styles
Right.
reflect different ways of seeing the world, different ways of understanding their relationship to the land.
Right.
Different ways of relating to each other.
And even like different ways of, being
Right.
and existing in the world, which is just incredible to think about.
Yeah, and I think the article also talks about how art styles differ so drastically between nations.
Yeah. We often think of Indigenous Australian art, and we have this very specific image in mind.
Right, like dot painting.
Right, exactly. And dot painting is beautiful, and it's an incredible art form,
Right,
but it's specific to certain groups.
right.
And it's important to recognize that other nations have entirely different
Completely different.
forms of artistic expression.
Yeah, and I think that's what I really loved about this article is that it highlighted a quote by an Indigenous elder,
Mm-hmm.
Auntie Munya Andrews.
Okay.
And she said, quote, "One size does not fit all when engaging with Indigenous communities," end quote.
It's a powerful statement.
Right, and so like, what do you think is like the deeper meaning behind that?
I think it's about respect.
Okay,
It's about recognizing that Indigenous Australians are not a monolith,
right,
that they are individuals with their own unique cultures and experiences,
right.
and that we need to approach our interactions with them with that understanding in mind.
So it's like just because, one Indigenous Australian from this one particular area
Right.
doesn't mean that you know everything about like every other Indigenous Australian.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It's like saying because you've met one person from France, you now understand all of European culture.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so important for anyone wanting to learn more about Indigenous Australia is that we can't rely on those broad generalizations. We have to really, dig deeper
Yeah.
and explore the specificities.
Yeah. Be willing to challenge our assumptions.
Yes.
And to be open to the incredible diversity that exists within Indigenous Australia.
And that kind of leads into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is this idea of multiculturalism.
Okay.
Because the article talks about how, Auntie Munya makes this really interesting point
Uh-huh.
about how essentially Indigenous people are experts in multiculturalism.
Right.
And so, like, what does she mean by that?
Well, think about it. Indigenous Australians have been interacting and exchanging knowledge with diverse groups across the continent
Okay.
for thousands of years.
For millennia.
Exactly.
So they've been doing it way before it became like a popular idea.
Right. Way before it became a buzzword in modern society.
Right.
And I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah, and it makes you think about like how much we can learn from them.
Absolutely.
About, really building those inclusive and respectful relationships
Mhm.
across these cultural boundaries.
Yeah. And the article also acknowledges that despite this rich history of multiculturalism, stereotypes and misconceptions about Indigenous Australia still persist.
Right.
And it seems those stereotypes can have very real and harmful consequences.
Yeah, and the article talks about this woman, Dr. Mariko Smith, who has both Yuin, which is an Indigenous Australian group,
Right.
and Japanese heritage.
Okay, interesting.
And she talks about how she's faced, racial slurs for being Asian.
Right.
But then, like, those same people were shocked to find out she was also Indigenous.
With their preconceived notions of what an Indigenous person should look like, just completely clashed with reality.
Yeah, and it really highlights the complexities of identity and, like,
Absolutely.
the insidious nature of prejudice.
Yeah, and I think it's a perfect example of how that kind of simplistic thinking can lead to harmful stereotypes.
Right.
People get stuck in these narrow boxes, and anything that challenges those boxes becomes a threat.
Right.
It shakes down the possibility of genuine understanding and connection.
Yeah, and I think it's a really powerful reminder of how much work we still need to do to challenge those stereotypes and to really create a truly inclusive society.
Absolutely, and I think Dr. Smith's experience also raises some important questions about internalized racism and the complexities of navigating multiple cultural identities.
Right.
It's something that we could definitely delve into further, but I think for now,
Yeah.
it's important to just sit with that and think about what that means for us as individuals and as a society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really highlights just how much work we have to do, but also how important it is to do that work.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to diving into that more.
Yeah, me too.
It's a really fascinating topic.
Yeah, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't really think about.
Right?
We often focus on the historical injustices,
Right.
which is important,
Absolutely vital.
but we also need to recognize, like, their ongoing contributions to society.
Yeah, and the knowledge that they hold.
Yeah, and like Auntie Munya talks about, indigenous knowledge systems,
Right.
particularly in eras like land management and ecological sustainability.
Right.
And it makes me think about, how much we could learn from them
Yeah.
about living in harmony with the land.
Absolutely. And how to address contemporary challenges like climate change.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we're really struggling with,
Right.
and especially in Australia with like the bushfires,
Yeah.
like Indigenous Australians have been using fire to manage the land for millennia.
Right. Controlled burning.
Yeah, and creating these healthier ecosystems and preventing those devastating wildfires.
Yeah, and that's knowledge that we desperately need right now.
Right.
As we're facing these increasingly frequent and intense bushfires.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder why these perspectives aren't more widely incorporated into our policy and decision making.
Right, that's a really good question.
Because it seems like there's so much that we could be learning.
Yeah, and the article doesn't really go into specific policy areas.
Right.
But I think it implicitly argues for a more inclusive approach.
Right.
One that recognizes the value of Indigenous knowledge.
Right.
And incorporates it into everything from environmental management
Right.
to education to healthcare.
Yeah, it makes you think about how much richer our understanding of these issues could be
Yeah.
if we were actually seeking out and integrating those diverse perspectives.
Right, it's not about tokenism.
Right.
It's about recognizing that Indigenous Australians have a vital role to play in shaping a just and sustainable future for all of us.
Absolutely. And so the article really encourages us to like go beyond textbooks and museums
Yeah.
and actually seek out opportunities to learn directly from Indigenous communities.
Right, go to community events.
Yeah, engage in respectful conversations.
Build relationships.
Yeah, and Auntie Manya puts it so beautifully. She says, quote, just introduce yourself, go along to community events, end quote.
I love that.
It's so simple,
Yeah.
but it's so powerful.
It's an invitation.
Yeah.
It's not a demand.
Right.
It's a recognition that we all have something to learn from each other.
Yeah, and that learning about Indigenous cultures shouldn't feel like a daunting task or a chore.
Right.
It should be about genuine connection and a willingness to step outside our comfort zones.
Exactly. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
There's always more to learn, more connections to make more stories to hear.
And it's like peeling back layers of an onion, like the more that you learn,
Right.
the more you realize how much more there is to learn.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it. It's an ongoing process of discovery and growth.
Yeah, and so for our listeners out there, like, what are some ways that you can continue exploring Indigenous cultures and languages present in your local area?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it could feel overwhelming at first,
Right.
but start small. Find out whose traditional lands you're living on.
Okay.
Reach out to local Indigenous organizations or community groups. Visit museums and cultural centers. Attend events and festivals.
Yeah.
The possibilities are endless.
And there are so many people who are passionate about sharing their cultures and their stories.
Absolutely.
So it's really just about taking that first step,
Yeah.
being curious and being open to the richness and complexity that awaits.
Exactly. And I think that's the most important takeaway from this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just about learning facts.
Right.
It's about fostering a sense of wonder and appreciation for the incredible diversity of Indigenous Australia.
Well said. And remember, this journey of learning and connecting
Yeah.
is an ongoing process.
It is.
It's about building bridges of understanding and working towards a more just and equitable future together. And that's what's so important about this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well said.
Thank you.
And that's it for our deep dive today, folks. We hope you've learned something new and feel inspired to continue exploring the incredible diversity of Indigenous Australia.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
So it's interesting because, we're talking about all this diversity, but the article also highlights like the depth of these cultures too.
Right.
Like it's not just about acknowledging the differences, it's about appreciating the richness and like the knowledge that these cultures hold.
Absolutely. And we often focus so much on the historical injustices,
Right.
which are incredibly important.
Of course.
But we also need to recognize their ongoing contributions into society.
Right. And their knowledge.
Exactly,
Like
yeah.
what they can teach us. And I think, Auntie Munya talks about the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems.
Yes.
Especially in areas like land management,
Right.
ecological sustainability. And it makes me talk about, how much we could learn from them.
Yeah.
About living in harmony with the land.
Absolutely. And how to address these contemporary challenges like climate change.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we really struggle with, like especially here in Australia with the bushfires.
Right.
Indigenous Australians have been using fire to manage the land
Yes.
for millennia.
Controlled burning.
Yeah, and they've been creating these healthier ecosystems and preventing those devastating wildfires.
Right.
And it's like we could really learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
that knowledge is so valuable.
Right.
Especially now as we're facing, increasingly frequent and intense bushfires.
Yeah, and it just makes me wonder why these perspectives aren't more widely incorporated into our policy and decision-making.
That's a great question.
And
And I think the article doesn't necessarily go into specific policy areas.
right.
But it definitely argues for a more inclusive approach.
Yeah.
One that recognizes the value of Indigenous knowledge.
Right.
And incorporates it into everything.
Right.
From environmental management to education to healthcare.
Yeah, it makes you think about how much richer our understanding of these issues could be.
Absolutely.
If we were actually seeking out and integrating those diverse perspectives.
It's not about tokenism.
Right.
It's about recognizing that Indigenous Australians have such a vital role to play in shaping a just and sustainable future for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so important about this article is that it really encourages us to go beyond like the textbooks and museums and to actually seek out those opportunities to learn directly from Indigenous communities.
Right. Go to community events.
Yeah, engage in those respectful conversations.
Build relationships.
Yeah, build relationship.
Actually get to know people.
Yeah, and Auntie Munya puts it so beautifully. She
She
says,
does.
quote, just introduce yourself, go along to community events, end quote.
I love that.
It's so simple,
Yeah.
but it's so powerful.
It's an invitation.
Yeah.
It's not a demand.
Right.
It's a recognition that we all have something to learn from each other.
Yeah, and I think that's the key takeaway here is that learning about Indigenous cultures shouldn't feel like this daunting task
Right.
or a chore.
It shouldn't feel like homework.
Yeah.
It should be about genuine connection.
Right.
And a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones.
Exactly. To be open to something new.
Yeah, and remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
There's always more to learn, more connections to make more stories to hear.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
I like that analogy.
Right, like the more that you learn, the more you realize how much more there is to learn.
And that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process of discovery and growth.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm kind of struck by like how much we've actually uncovered about Indigenous diversity in Australia.
A lot, right?
It's like peeling back these layers and it reveals this incredibly like rich and complex tapestry.
Right, and it really highlights how much there is to like learn and unlearn when it comes to Indigenous Australia.
Yeah, we've talked about like so many things.
Yeah, like the 500 distinct nations, the incredible linguistic diversity, the unique art forms, the deep knowledge systems.
Yeah. It's mind-boggling.
It really is.
But I keep coming back to that phrase from Auntie Munya, one size does not fit all.
Right.
And it's a reminder that, even with all these commonalities that we've been talking about, each Indigenous community got its own unique story to tell.
Absolutely. And it's about moving away from those generalizations.
Right.
And engaging with the specificities of each nation.
Right.
each community, each individual.
Yeah, and it requires a real shift in perspective.
You know?
Like a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones and just embrace the beauty of that difference.
Yeah. And I think this deep dive has really given us a glimpse
Yeah.
into this vast and vibrant world.
It's like we've just scratched the surface.
Right, exactly. And it's up to each of us to kind of continue exploring,
Yeah.
to seek out those stories, to build those connections,
Right.
to really deepen our understanding.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so important about this is that it's not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about building relationships based on respect and reciprocity.
Absolutely.
And recognizing that Indigenous Australians aren't just the custodians of this ancient wisdom, but they're active participants in shaping the present and future of this country.
Exactly.
So for our listeners out there, what are some ways that you can continue exploring these Indigenous cultures and languages in your local area?
That's a great question. And I know it can feel kind of overwhelming at first.
Right.
But start small. Find out whose traditional lands you're living on.
Okay.
Reach out to local Indigenous organizations or community groups. Visit museums and cultural centers. Attend events and festivals.
Yeah, there are so many opportunities.
They really are.
And I think, there are so many people who are so passionate about sharing their cultures and their stories.
Absolutely.
So it's really just about taking that first step. Being curious and being open.
Yeah, being open to that richness and that complexity that awaits.
And that's really, I think, the most important takeaway from this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just about learning facts.
Right.
It's about fostering that sense of wonder and appreciation for the incredible diversity of Indigenous Australia.
Beautifully said. I think that's a perfect way to sum it up.
Yeah, and remember that this journey of learning and connecting is an ongoing process.
It is.
It's about building those bridges of understanding and working towards a more just and equitable future together.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that's it for our deep dive today, folks. We hope you've learned something new and feel inspired to continue exploring the incredible diversity of Indigenous Australia. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.